Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Melissa, the Partner Marketing Manager here at Mitratech, and we're glad that you're joining us for this session at the Paylocity Elevate conference. Today, we're diving into navigating the Fair Chance Act, the essential updates for background screening. It's a topic that continues to grow in importance as regulations evolve and hiring expectations shift across the country. Over the next hour, you'll get a clear look at what's changing in fair chance compliance, what HR teams should be preparing for, and how organizations can strengthen their screening processes with confidence. We'll touch on emerging requirements, what they need operationally, and the practical steps that help teams stay fair, consistent, and ready for whatever comes next. And to guide us through all of this, we're incredibly fortunate to have someone who brings deep expertise into the space. Tanya has been with AssureHire since 2018 and brings nearly 20 years of experience in the HR technology world. She holds the PBSA Advanced certification, is an active member of the Professional Background Screening Association, and volunteers across multiple committees, including Public Access Committee, which plays a key role in maintaining screening across the U.S. We're excited to have her leading today's discussion. And with that, please join me in welcoming Tanya. Tanya, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining and for listening to this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Very excited to present with you today. So I just got back from the PBSA National Conference, and this was a very hot topic, how the Fair Chance Act is changing the landscape. So excited to talk about this movement. We're going to also talk today about the employer responsibilities, some compliance steps, and practical implications for hiring decisions. We'll look at smart screening strategies, how to align your background screening with jobs, and really tie it to the roles and the business necessity of your organization. We'll jump into how to update your policies, some processes for updating, and then last but not least, look ahead to national trends, technology, and the future of compliant hiring. All right, so setting the stage here, ban the box. I'm sure most of you are familiar with ban the box, but we're gonna just give a quick overview. Ban the box originated to give people with criminal records a fair chance at employment, right? So it literally means to remove the checkbox that refers to criminal history on applications. This law, it varies from state to county and even city levels. So California, New York, 2014 through 2016, they started enacting these state laws. And it even changes per state. So for example, in California, this applies to any organization with 5 or more employees, whereas you look at Illinois, it's 15 or more employees. And if that's not complicated, it even can go down to the city level. So Austin, Texas was the first city in the South to enact a ban the box law in 2016. And till this day, Texas doesn't have ban the box, but if you go to Austin, you employ in Austin, you need to follow this. And then at the county level as well. So it's always been challenging for employers when it comes to background screening to keep up with these various laws. But now we're seeing the Fair Chance Act really start to expand beyond this. So today we're going to really dig into how employers are now needing to evaluate criminal history. In addition, and really like assess this criminal history and do individual assessments in some of the states that have already passed these laws, and really I believe that are going to come soon in the future. And we'll look at how employers can really prepare for the national adoption of these principles. And the idea here is to get ahead. So as an example, I started with AssureHire in 2018. And in 2018, we were doing employment verifications and including salary questions, right? So what was their salary when they started? What was their salary when they left? Seeing ban the box really start to take shape, and laws that were starting to come onto the scene where you're no longer allowed to ask about salary, we saw over the next several years that 14 plus states adopted different types of regulation around asking for salary. So as a credit reporting agency, a screening company, we decided to adopt this early, and we stopped asking about salary for our verifications. And in fact, to this day, whenever we get proof of employment via, a W-2, or a pay stub, we redact this information. So I think this applies to employers as well, because as you're seeing, if you operate, if you operate now in California, Washington, Colorado, Illinois, or New York, right? You're going to want to, it makes sense to potentially apply these practices that you're putting into place and make them consistent across the United States and really start to adopt these practices. Skipped a slide. I want to go back for just a second too. Part of this fair chance movement, and really the pit of it, like where it stems from, it's all about reducing barriers for individuals with criminal records, right? It's about taking it a step further beyond ban the box to these assessments, to this rationale. And like I just mentioned, it's going to continue moving in this direction. All right, so timing. Go back to this slide. Timing. The idea here in these states currently is to look at criminal history. So beyond ban the box, you're supposed to look at criminal history and determine how each decision, right? Each decision that you are influenced to make, and then based off of the job, you can then retract the offer and then kick off an assessment. So I'm sorry, I didn't really explain that very well, but what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is the timing of when you need to do these assessments. And everyone who does background screening and uses a third-party vendor is familiar at least a little bit with the adverse action process. But with the assessment piece, this is something that you actually do before you retract an offer, right? So you're supposed to start to fill out this assessment and give the candidate an opportunity during the pre-adverse action process. So what pre-adverse is it requires, it's required by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA. And the idea behind it is to give applicants a fair chance to review and correct their information. So, if you're doing Fair Chance Act and really elevating this, you're going to do an assessment. You're going to send out this pre-adverse action letter, and give the candidate time to provide as much information as possible, as to why, what happened. You want to take in different types of assessments. And then, it's worth mentioning, AssureHire, we recently changed our pre-adverse action timeline. It used to be across the board that all of us screening companies agreed that 5 days was the appropriate amount of time. And then we would send out that final adverse automatically. Well, now we recently bumped that out to 10 complete days. So it's really only 7 business days. And the reason for that is to give you, the employer, more time to work on this assessment and to take in all of the various data points that a candidate can provide to you. Next, we have the adverse action. So, that's the letter that I just mentioned. That goes out now, at least for us, it goes out 10 days later. But depending on what company you're with, that is sent out automatically on your behalf. Moving on. The challenges that employers face, right? There's so many different challenges that intersect with this. Often when I speak with an HR professional about background screening, I find that they're really working with policies, screening policies that they inherited from a predecessor. And so, one part of advice that I have off the get-go, is when you're switching vendors, it's a good idea to really to look at what you're doing and speak with an expert and reevaluate because it's almost impossible to keep up with all the patchwork of laws across the United States, and you very well may be out of compliance. For example, if you're not doing these assessments in California, New York, Illinois, this is something you definitely want to get with your legal about and start to get these forms together, which I'll give you a sneak peek of what that looks like in just a few minutes. Um, Next, a lot of times it's hard to even keep up with jurisdiction, like where you're running, the different levels of access that you're going to get, and how much information and how far back it's going to go. So a great example of this is Michigan in 2020 passed something called the Clean Slate Law, right? And what's unique about this law that went into effect in April of 2023 is that now for certain types of misdemeanors, certain types of criminal offenses, after 7 years, this information is being automatically expunged on behalf of the person. Um, Most states, a lot of states have, if you get a lawyer and you have criminal history and you go back after a certain period of time, you can petition the court to actually expunge your data. And this is often granted, but it's expensive for the candidate. It requires getting a lawyer, it requires navigating that process. Whereas what Michigan is doing today is they're automatically expunging information based off of criteria that they've created, right? And keeping up with that criteria can be kind of tricky. I had a situation that I learned about on the subcommittee recently where there was a person who was convicted of murder, got out of jail about a year and a half ago. And when the employer ran the counties in Michigan, it didn't come up. And so, I mean, that's confusing. Why, in most cases, in almost every state, when you take in prison time, that actually brings those records into scope. But for some reason, I believe it was Clark County in Michigan, they decided to redact information at 6 years, and it required for the screening vendor to actually do extra research and pull records that they wouldn't normally need to pull. Like it didn't come up on a natural search on their stations. So what the screening company did is they went ahead and ran a statewide search. And when they ran the statewide search, they found these records, right? They were able to see the murder charge and the conviction. And so that gives me, even more pause because as an employer, now if you're running background screening in Michigan, you likely, if you really want to get in-depth records, you likely should be running the statewide search as well as the counties because they're using different sources. The statewide is relying on criminal, on police reports, arrest records, whereas the counties are subject to this clean slate law and having information that is getting automatically redacted. And in this case, I think there was a mistake in redacting that information, but all the same, to get a complete record, unless you talk to an expert that knows about this, it would be very easy as an employer to miss this really important information. Next, really getting your packages to align with your roles can be quite challenging. And ensuring that your packages align with what you think you're getting. So I have another example here. And then I'm sure most companies, and in fact, 99.9% of packages, there's something called the National Criminal Search that companies include. And the National Criminal Search is a search that all background screening vendors essentially were getting the data from the same places. And this is everything that can be scraped easily online. And when I say easily, it doesn't necessarily need to be easily, but it just needs to be able to be automated and accessed online, gets thrown into the National Criminal Search. So you have sex offender registries, you have counties, you have states, you have all of this information that can be scraped online. It doesn't have an access fee attached to it. Well, I met with this company in Mississippi and I asked them, what are you looking for when you run a background check? What are, for these positions that you're hiring for, what's important to you? Well, they were they're very adamant that they didn't want anybody with a sex offender history, because these people were public facing. They also said they wanted to know about, felonies that had any kind of abuse, anything violent. These were the type of history that were important to them. So I asked them what they were running, and they said, "Well, we're running the National Criminal Search." And the National Criminal Search is instant, right? It's something very quick database, boom, you hit it. And if there's anything on it, it tells you where to go look and pull those records. Well, that was a bit of an alarm to me because I know Mississippi is a very manual state. So I went ahead and pulled what sources were feeding into the National Criminal Search. And I found out that out of 82 counties, only 11 sources, and I'm not even talking about the whole county. It might just be like a specific police station, for example. Only 11 sources were feeding into the National Criminal Search. So this tells me that this company is essentially doing a background check, paying very little for it, but also getting very little for it because it's not really doing much in the state that they operate in. So my advice as well is not only to look at why you're running background screening, but if you have an opportunity to talk with someone who really understands where the data comes from, and where how it's put together, you might even want to customize packages and what you run based off of the localities that you operate in. So what the law requires and why does it matter for the Fair Chance Act? Well, first, it's always important to delay a background check until a conditional offer is made. So any of those 180 places that have ban the box always makes it very clear that an offer needs to be made, and that usually can be verbal. Written, right, is better, but you need to it had the intention of hiring someone before you run a background check. So we're really trying to get away from you just running background checks and using that as a way to determine who you want to talk with and decide whether to hire them or not. That would be a big red flag. From there, you want to conduct an individual assessment of any criminal history that comes back. So you want to explain why a conviction actually disqualifies a candidate. And from there, you're expected to provide written notice, the adverse action process, and provide an opportunity for that candidate to respond. So not only is a candidate able to respond if they want to dispute information during the adverse process, but now if they want to come back to you and give you their story and give you any other information, the idea is to take that into account as well. I can't recommend enough talking to counsel about this. It is very tricky to put together these policies and procedures. I am willing to bet that some internal counsels are much more qualified to do this than others, and there are definitely legal options out there for companies that specialize in this. I would be happy to provide some referrals if you want to reach out to me after this presentation. Going to the Professional Background Screening Association conference every year, I definitely have the opportunity to meet these lawyers and talk with some of the best in the industry. I thought, as an example, it would be helpful to show you what an assessment looks like. So this is an example of an assessment I pulled from California. This is on one of California's public websites. Here, the basics of what the assessment include, all of the information, because you're going to hold on to this, the specific duties and responsibilities of the job. So you're going to go ahead and, regarding that specific position, explain what they do, and then describe how the criminal conduct and why this is a concern in respect to the actual position that person is in. So this is where you would record that information. You look at how long ago the crime was committed, right? So, something that was done 2 years ago versus 15 years ago, they're different. And based on that, what factors are you considering that are making you rescind that offer? So this is a really good baseline of what a evaluation looks like. And if you are looking for an example, you're welcome to reach out to us, or go on California and search for the individual assessment, and it will bring up this form. So aligning screening strategies with job roles. Defining why for each position, tying each element of screening to why it's a legitimate necessity, and then here's the challenge to you: maybe building out different screening packages per job. Often when I meet with companies, they'll have maybe one or two packages, a standard package and a standard plus driving if they're someone who's driving. But there's actually a lot of opportunity to really get further, to drill down further on this. So, obviously, if you're hiring someone who's driving, you wanna run the motor vehicle record. You wanna do this for safety reasons, for insurance reasons. It saves you money on your insurance if you're doing this frequently. If you're hiring someone who's an accountant who has high level access to your financials, this is where you can look at various searches that help you to bring into scope, if they've had convicted any crimes, at the federal level that are over $50,000, or if they have experience going back on contracts. These are types of searches that do with financial history. Another example is if you're a teacher, you're hiring a teacher, you're obviously going to want to ensure that there's no types. You're going to want to look at all types of criminal records to ensure the safety of these minors. I because this is what I do, I think it's helpful also to do just a little bit deeper dive on what I was just talking about here. Finance, a lot of times when people are hiring for finance roles, they think to do credit, right? Credit I find to be one of the most difficult reports to adjudicate. Adjudicate means make a hiring decision on and evaluate. If I were hiring someone who's a finance or a very high executive role in my organization, I would want to look at the federal courts. I would also look at the civil courts. So if you have history going back on your contracts, or a lawyer, that's where you would find that in civil courts. And then actually, if you don't know how you're going to, what criteria you're going to evaluate a credit report on, it's really good to figure out what that looks like before you start looking at them. Or there's another search that doesn't require as much setup. It's called bankruptcies, liens, and judgments. And it literally does what it says, right? It shows you if someone has a lien on them, they've recently filed bankruptcy, and maybe them being leveraged in that type of role or leveraged in that sort of way would affect their ability to have access to what you're providing at your place of employment. So that might be something you could switch out as well. For safety sensitive positions, it's important to look at DUIs, motor vehicle records, violence related offenses. So most criminal searches are going to give you that sort of information. If it's customer facing role, I feel like you're going to want to know about theft. You're definitely going to want to know about sex offender. You're going to want to know as much as you can about these types of roles. And then I have another example here that I think is really important. Whenever I talk to companies that have employees going into people's homes, whether that be in healthcare or maybe the various trades, I recommend that they bring in an employment verification. Why? Well, years ago, Spectrum in 2019, they lost a $7 billion lawsuit for hiring negligence. And what's crazy about this precedent is that they actually did a criminal background check, but they didn't check the previous employers of the person's application. And it turns out that person made that information up. So this tells us now that if you're going to put people in people's homes, you should not only run the best criminal background check you possibly can. So I'm thinking the state, the federal, the county, but you should also check their previous employment to ensure that their credentials and their experience actually is what they say it is. So unfortunately, that does end up being a pretty expensive background check in some cases. And, unfortunately, if you're in New York, for example, I'm sure anyone who's ever run a background check in New York has had sticker shock when they see that $95 access fee. But yeah, it's an important aspect to include in your package if you're running folks that are going into people's homes. So when to disqualify, what you can do, what you can't do. I like this because here's something that a lot of you can do today. Earlier we talked about California and New York, how they have various cutoffs at 7 years. Did you know that depending on the county and the state, that the amount of data and how far they go back varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And in fact, you might actually go and run a background check and say, look, our company wants to only evaluate 7 years. But then what happens if you're given 20 years worth of data and you find something 15 years ago and you're like, wait a minute, that's against our policy. What should we do here? Well, my recommendation is that you tell the background screening company that you have a strict policy around 7 years and ask for them to apply those California rules to essentially all of your background checks. So you could actually have a setting where they scrub everything over 7 years, making it so that you're not put into a difficult situation. In addition to, you want to evaluate the relevance and how it in fact affects the job duties that they're doing. But you also want to consider, items such as recency. So feeding again off of that 7 year, I have a story for you. I had a company in the last couple of years. One of the HR professionals gave me a call and they were asking for my advice. And I'm going to tell you right now that I did not give advice here, but I did have a conversation. I think I'm always open to having a conversation. But what happened is they were hiring for a clinical research associate. And this person was in, I believe, their 40s. And this person came back with a sex offender hit. Now a little color around this. This person, when they were 18 years old, were in the military, decided to flash a car full of women. Unfortunately, they made a poor decision that cost them dearly because in that car happened to be a military officer's daughter. That military officer took this person to court, and now this person has been and will be on the Department of Justice sex offender registry for the rest of their life. Now, looking at this role, we're talking about something that was like 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, they've since had several positions and they've gotten accredited for what they do, right? They have gone to school. And the employer was asking me, well, Tanya, what do I do? Do we hire them? Do we not hire them? And honestly, it would be really helpful in this case. They did have a 7 year look back, what they were supposed to be looking at, but they hadn't made that adjustment and said, look, cut this off. So in this case, I believe they decided to hire the person anyway. It wasn't something that I advised on, but it's definitely something that, I hope they took into account. Like looking at someone, I know I'm in my mid 40s, who I was at 18 is nothing like who I am today. You can kind of see which way I'm leaning on this, but it definitely did not provide advice here. Also, when looking at whether you're disqualify someone or not, is really taking into account their rehabilitation and their restitution. Example, like maybe they got a DUI and got into a really bad accident. Have they been in AA since then for how many years, right? Do they volunteer for and speak and go to schools or whatever the case? So what have they done since then? Is something that you're supposed to take into account when you're thinking about the Fair Chance Act and the evolution of that and how to bring it into your workplace. And then last but not least, really weighing the severity and the potential ongoing risk. It's not always as black and white as saying like, obviously you're not going to want to hire someone with a sex-related charge that's going to be doing healthcare and dealing with patients. But do you want to run a sex offender registry on someone who's working alone in in a warehouse? I mean, really, that's not something I'm here to advise you on, but this is something you definitely need to get with your legal team to figure out as much as possible before you have to make these types of decisions. All right, so want to talk a little bit about the quality of data. And I actually talked about this earlier, that not all records are available in every jurisdiction. I talked about Michigan. That was where I originally intended to talk about that story I told earlier, was on this slide. The idea of when it makes sense for you to run a statewide search versus a county search, maybe when you want to run one or the other or both, really understanding how incomplete data affects, a search. If you're hiring nationwide, where the holes are, I think it's helpful to understand the quality of that data when you're making these types of decisions. And partnering with someone who's really going to explain those to you if you have questions, I think is extremely, extremely helpful. All right, so taking steps on your policy. It's having a policy in place is always going to be helpful. Always. It's going to save you time, lots of time. So, setting this up so that you know what disqualifying offenses are and why, and having them written out is helpful. Here's an example that I can give you here. For those of you who do drug testing, currently urine drug testing still remains the most popular type of drug testing in the United States. However, sidebar, I would say I'm a bigger fan of oral drug testing. If you're interested in learning about oral drug testing and the benefits of it, please reach out. I would love to talk about it. It's something I specialize in. But I digress. Going back to urine drug testing, if you're currently doing that today or have at a previous company, you'll see something that comes up called a negative dilute. A negative dilute means they drank too much water, right? And the sample didn't have enough, wasn't strong enough to know if there were any drugs in it. Well, I had a company call me up and they didn't know what to do. And making this decision took days out of their hiring process, where this really easily could have been in their policy and their handbook. They could have understood, set this up ahead of time, and it would have saved a lot of time. They didn't know what to do when the person got a second negative dilute. They're like, what do we do? Tanya, should we hire them? Should we send them back again? Like, what do you recommend? Well, I wasn't able to make any recommendations, but what I can say is that I have had the opportunity to work with a lot of companies, and in most situations, companies allow a person to have one negative dilute. If they get a second, they don't hire them. But not having that into a policy and making a different decision each time definitely opens up that company to liability, to unfair. Someone saying that it's unfair. If they let one person do it or not another person take a third test. So making that black and white would definitely be helpful. Next, the storage of these assessments. You want to hold on to these individualized assessments. And unfortunately, most background screening companies, in fact, even ours, we're not going to help you with that. Just getting back from the Professional Background Screening Association National Conference in LA a few weeks ago, this was a hot topic, and every single lawyer up there that spoke said, as a background screening company, we do not recommend you help people with these assessments or employers with these assessments. This is definitely an employer-only responsibility, and it is something that they need to hold on to. So if you want to follow best practices here from my standpoint, as CRAs, credit reporting agencies, we're actually required per law to hold on to background screening reports for 6 years. So 6 years, we hold on to reports, we get rid of them at 7. So if I were you, I would just look at that as a precedent, and I would hold on to these reports or to these assessments internally for at least 6 years. Also, sidebar, if you don't do background screening electronically, or if you ever make an exception where you provide someone with written, get written consent manually on paper, show them the disclosures manually on paper, you also should hold on to those reports at that point for those required 6 years as well. Fun fact, you know, if somebody wants, I did this webinar earlier, and one of the questions was, who should provide a copy of the report? Should we do that for the candidate or the new hire, or not? And my answer to that was, well, as a background screening company, we are actually legally required to give access to background screening reports to an employee if they're hired for 2 years. If they're not hired for 1 year. I can speak freely for AssureHire. We actually give them access the entire time that we have it. So really, the onus of you providing that report is on the background screening company like us. We are going to give them continuous access to that report. Next, let's go back to what we're talking about here. You want to define your steps for adverse action documentation. Most screening companies help you with the adverse action process. They provide the templates here. It's actually something meant to be like when this started, the idea was would be something that employers own. But fortunately, background screening companies help with this. And this is also a reason why most companies don't allow you to make any changes. We make sure that these adverse action letters are as airtight as possible, that we're following all the various rules. But it's up to you to have a policy and really define the steps that you're going to take outside of just sending the pre-adverse and the adverse action letter, and how many days you're going to give someone to respond, when you reach out, how you reach out. All of those sorts of things are things that you can put into your policies. And then, like any good policy, whether that be, for drug and alcohol or whatever the case may be, you want to review these on an annual basis, at least for compliance. And if you had anything that was challenging that year prior that you noticed wasn't in your current policy, it's a great time to make those edits and those changes when you review these annually. And it doesn't have to be in the first of the year when you're doing a million other things like, going through benefits. You can have another time in the year that you do this when you have some more downtime, but definitely reviewing these policies is helpful. In addition to these policies, reviewing them, it's about getting buy-in from the people that are going to be on your front line. Training your hiring managers on not only what to do, but why you do it. Especially when ban the box is involved, you don't want managers asking these people during their interview about their criminal history. So explaining to them what's at stake if they don't follow these fair chance related laws is important. And continuing to emphasize this, continuing to have these annual trainings where you explain to anybody who's involved with hiring what their responsibility looks like and how important it is to follow your policies. I'm also going to just kind of throw in a little piece here, another sidebar, which I tend to do. If you have a drug and alcohol policy and you do DOT hiring for the Department of Transportation, right? You need to follow DOT practices. You cannot say that same policy is what you do for people that are non-DOT. You actually have to have a separate policy for both. So that's just a little nugget in case you do that. It's, you have to look at the role, once again, what they're doing, and have separate policies and really make this about the position as much as you possibly can. A centralized review of background screening reports, at least with our company, we have a lot of different levels, levers that you can turn so that various people have different levels of access. So a good example of this is often recruiters have the ability to submit a background check, but it's a little more rare for them to have access to the full reports. I would say an even less amount of people should have access to make decisions in regarding to adverse or not. So the more people that you give access to do the adjudication standards or kick off the adverse action process, the more training that you have to do and the more people that you need to make sure understand what your policies are. So allowing like if it's a larger company, one or two people, right, or really keeping the people that have the highest level of HR training, giving them that ability to do these sorts of things and make these kinds of decisions is a smart move. It will allow for a more consistent process across your organization when you have less people involved in making those decisions. Um, Using consistent adverse action templates, like I mentioned, if you're using a background screening company, they're going to give those to you, but you want to be consistent and always use them. Here's a fun fact. If you are doing the adverse action process, and let's say you go and do a social media search on the side, right? And you go do a social media search on the side. You don't ask the company, the background screening company to do it, which you should. Do you have to do the adverse action process if you decide not to hire them, even though you went and did your own search? Well, the answer is no. The adverse action process is specifically regulated by the FCRA. It's required by background screening companies when you use a background screening company. However, if you go and do searches outside of using a background screening company, you also aren't protected under those rules as well. So highly recommend that if you're doing any other searches outside, don't. Utilize your screening vendor to do those things and have a consistent adverse action process that really applies to everything screening related. And once again, pull the audits that, pull the decisions that you made throughout the year and review them. Maybe review them as part of your examples for training, part of examples for managers to reinforce why you do what you do when you do it, right? Why you have these policies in place, why you're meeting with them on an annual basis to reinforce them. It's about looking back and auditing your year prior and seeing how you did, if there's something that you can change to make it better. We're getting ready to wrap up pretty soon here, but I want to high level touch on some five strategies for the benefits of compliance driven screening, and really tie that back to the Fair Chance Act. So, employers that have fair chance hiring practices tend to have reduce their turnover through these fair evaluation processes. So good example of this is Dave's Bread. It's a very popular bread company. They made themselves a second chance employer. By becoming a second chance employer, they were able to elevate their brand and reputation for having fairness and integrity. They were able to reduce their turnover by up to 60%. And also were able to expand their pool of people that they hire from. So I just took this a step further. I'm talking about being a second chance company, but in these roles that they had, they determined that there are a lot of jobs that they would be willing to give people a second chance on, and they defined it. And it really helped turn their hiring around in their organization and expanded their access to qualified talent. I also want to say, in regards to compliance-driven screening, I talked earlier about doing employment verifications. Well, did you know that companies that do employment verifications have a 28% higher 6-month retention rate and a 45% higher 1-year rate? So that's interesting, right? I thought that would be a fun fact to throw in here. And if you want to find where I got these data and statistics, feel free to reach out to me. But yeah, having good practices in place for your screening, having policies in place takes the guessing out of adjudication, and really helps align your compliance with your business strategy. And being able to say that you actually have a strategy is something that is helpful. All right, we're wrapping up the road ahead. I'm going to call it now. You are going to see more states start to require these individual assessments. As someone on the Public Access Committee, we're currently fighting for the right for employers to even run background checks. It is something that is really challenging for us. And I think that a good compromise is because, the idea, once again, behind this is that, people want to give. There are groups, organizations out there fighting for people that have been convicted of crimes to have a second chance at employment. And I think, a good middle ground, as opposed to taking away birth dates and making it so you can't run a background check, is instead to require these assessments. So this is something that we as screening companies, our screening professionals and the Professional Screening Association are using as a negotiating tool to find a middle ground, is the idea around these assessments. And if we're able to win these types of, with California, with Michigan, if we're able to win these types of conversations and, get support, I'm calling it now that they're going to be more Fair Chance Act rules around how you hire and use background screening. Also, AI was a very hot topic. I'm sure for people that went to this conference or at this conference, you're going to AI. AI is everywhere. Well, AI laws are starting to come into effect as well. This applies to you if your background screening company, does automated adjudication. If they do automated adjudication for you, it's one thing to automatically pass people, but you never want a background screening company to automatically send an adverse on your behalf without you seeing it. That is a huge no-no, huge red flag. So please don't do it. I hope that screening companies aren't doing that, but if they are, just giving you some unsolicited advice here. Obviously adopting transparent, explainable screening practices and making sure that people that you hire understand them, as well as your managers and the people that are at your company understand what your practices are, I think is important. And the more inclusive that you can be with your compliance, the more that you're going to have a competitive advantage. Definitely want to pass that competitive advantage on to you guys. Closing thoughts. The goal isn't to hire perfectly, it's to hire responsibly. Balancing safety, compliance, and inclusion leads to you having more defensible hiring decisions. If you've liked this content today, or if this is something that you like to keep up on HR compliance in general, background screening, I'd like to invite you to mitratech.com. We have a really good human resource page where we keep up with various blogs that we've written, other thought leadership that we're involved in. I'm going to give myself a plug. I just recently wrote a pretty popular article on the government shutdown and how it has been affecting background screening, and what the delays and what is actually delayed and affected by it. So if you're interested in that, you're welcome to go check out that article, as well as several other really helpful articles that we try to do our best to put out and keep you guys informed. Want to thank you for joining today. I'm Tanya Jeter. If you have any questions, concerns, want to have a conversation, I love this stuff. I'm passionate about it. You are more than welcome to reach out to me. My email is tanya.jeter@mitratech.com. And I always am available and willing to help. Thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate your time. And thanks to Paylocity for including us. I'm a huge Paylocity fan. And in fact, Mitratech as an organization is a Paylocity customer. So all of you have chosen well, and I hope you're happy. Thanks again.